Okay, you've made it to the final part, and I promise this one is much quicker and will take less time than the others. But some of what I'm about to say may be the most important things you hear throughout all the videos on growing a church. First, I want to talk about pragmatic ways of leading the church. These are pragmatic things that, honestly, if you don't do them and do them well, doesn't matter what else you do, you will find people resisting you, you will find people criticizing you, and you will lose your leadership. So these are things that I trained myself to do. I'm going to tell you really quickly, if you look at my Myers-Briggs, I am on the boundary between introvert and extrovert. I'm actually something called an outrovert, which is I can act like an extrovert, but I really like more introverted type things. So if I do a workshop like this, I need like almost a whole day to recover and just be by myself. But an introvert is also somebody who kind of sees things differently. At any rate, will just make me an I or an E, but I'm an introvert, extrovert, but I am also feeling oriented rather than thinking, which would surprise you because I've written a lot of books which are very thinking oriented. I tend to be intuitive rather than sensing, which means I don't put things into categories. I am able to see a lot of different things. But the most important thing is I am way off the chart as a perceiving person, not a judging person. That surprises most people because I have trained myself to operate as a J, as someone who is judging, who is organized and puts things into order, even though I am perfectly comfortable in chaos, which feels like it's somewhat more my natural state. Maybe not chaos, but being able to just go with the flow of everything. And so these are pragmatic things that regardless of what your personality type is, if you don't do these fairly well, it's going to come back to bite you. Number one, answer your emails, texts, and voicemails within 6 to 24 hours. You know, it's funny because I will see people's phones and they'll have 700 texts there that they've not answered, or at least that little red dot is still on there. They will have 400 emails that they haven't answered. I will tell you that when you are leading a church, if you take long to respond to somebody, they think you don't care. It's not fair. Maybe they shouldn't think that way, but it just is the way they are. When you don't answer texts or emails quickly or relatively quickly, people think you don't care. And this is difficult because it can mean having to respond in an email where you aren't sure what to say. But I will tell you what I do, even if I don't have enough time to think about it, I will respond usually within 2 hours and say, I got your email. I really appreciate what you're saying. Give me another day, or give me a few more hours, or give me a few more whatever to answer it. Again, this may not matter to you, but I am telling you, when you are leading a church and you do not respond to people, people turn off to you. And I have seen so many pastors who do this and they're surprised that there's conflict as a result. But remember what I said earlier, live in the land of is, not the land of should. Maybe people shouldn't be this way, but that is just the way they are. A second thing is engage with people before and after worship, after meetings, after classes, and after events. Actually, even if you're not part of the event, it's more important that you are there beforehand and afterwards to talk to people than being there during it. I found that before worship or after worship, I didn't always know what to say. And especially after worship, I would just be exhausted and tired and I just wanted to go home. But I would stay in the church till the last person left. And even if that last person was just cleaning up after coffee, I would go and talk to that person. Remember what I said. I'm a little bit more of an introvert than an extrovert, so this is not what I want to do. But I hear so much feedback from people who've had pastors who say they never talk to me. You know, they go to their office right after worship and we never see them. They don't engage me. Also, along with this, is remembering people's names. You know, I'm not good at remembering people's names, but I've learned how to do it. You know, usually what I do is if I'm there before they come in, when a visitor comes in, I'll say hi to them and say, I'm really glad, and I'll ask them what their name is. And then I will, in my responses to them, I will say their name 2 more times. You know, George, it's so great to have you. So George, where are you from? George, are you visiting from another church, or are you just in for town, or tell me what's going on? And then I would write them down on a slip of paper, and afterwards I would go and greet people, and I would look at the list of the people, of the names of the people that I saw. And then I would say their names again, I would say it again, and I would talk to them a little bit. And as they were leaving, I would say, George, thanks so much for being here. And then I would take that, put it on my desk, and before the next worship service, I would take a look at it and try to remember those names and remember their faces. Now, if someone didn't show up for another month, I'm probably not going to remember them. But I did the work to try to remember names, because I found when you remember people's names, they feel seen and they feel like you care about them. Another thing, and this is really hard, it's something I learned from counseling. I'll tell you a little story. Back when I first started as a counselor, before I even became a pastor, before I got a master's in counseling, I was a therapist in a psychiatric hospital in Virginia for 2 years. And I had a client who was really struggling in grief over the death of his sister, who had had an overdose. And I was really struggling with where to go, because we'd be talking. It was very clear he trusted me, but we just didn't seem to be going anywhere. And so I went to my supervisor, who's a psychologist, and he suggested that we videotape my session. And so we did. And, you know, I was pretty proud of my work. I thought, you know, I'm doing really good. I'm giving him good guidance. I'm giving him. So anyway, afterwards, we're in his office. He cues up the videotape with his VCR recording machine, and we start watching it. And I'm kind of proud of my work. And he says to me, man, Graham, you really care about him, don't you? I said, yeah, absolutely. He says, you're doing a lot of work. You know, you're working really hard to help this kid. I said, yeah. And he said, you know what else? You're working so hard, you're not leaving any room for him to work. You're doing all the work for him. You're asking him questions and you're answering the questions. You're giving him guidance, but you're not giving him time to reflect on it, because it's the first time he's ever heard this stuff, and he's only 14 years old. You know, give him time. He said, Graham, you're doing good work. You care. You've got the essentials, but you're working harder than your client. Never work harder than your client. Learn the same thing in the church. Never work harder than your congregation. Most of us work way harder than our congregation. But when we work harder than them, we don't leave room for them to do the work. We complain about the 80-20 rule in churches where 20% do 80% of the work. But actually, the reason that happens is often that 20% won't give up what they do. And this is true for us as pastors. We feel like we have to do everything, and then we feel exhausted. And you know, to get out of doing that, sometimes it means you have to work much harder in the beginning to be able to step back. When I first went to Calvin Church, I realized I could not lead the church and visit everybody who was homebound and in need. So we created a visitation team of people who would go visit the homebound once a month. And they would explain to them why they were there and not me. And sometimes the people criticized me through them, but we trained them on how to tell them, well, it's because Graham cares about you that we sent here. And I had to work to train these people on how to do this. But once I had trained them, they were taking care of that. That took a huge load off my work so I could focus on other things. Answer emails, texts, and everything else within 6 to 24 hours. Engage with people before and after worship, meetings, classes, and events. Don't work harder than your congregation. And one of the biggest ones now is live a balanced life. An unbalanced pastor eventually falls. You cannot give everything you have to your church. You need friends from outside the church. You need to go out on dates with your spouses. You need time for fun with your family. You need to exercise, because nobody in your church is ever going to tell you to get healthy. You have to claim the balance. And it's okay to say to people, I need some time off. It's okay to say to people, I'm sorry, I can't meet with you at that time. That's when I exercise. You may get pushback, but it doesn't matter. I have had actually too many pastor friends who have died because they have not taken care of themselves. You need to live a balanced life, and you need to work on it with others. Talk to your family about how do you do it. Talk to your board about how to do it. Next, move the church forward at their pace, not your pace. Churches don't resist change, they resist the pace of change. And I often say, one small step for pastor is often one giant leap for congregation kind. You have gone to seminary. You suffer from something that they know in the marketing field, which is the curse of expertise. When you become an expert in something, you no longer remember what it was like to not be an expert in that thing. You're already there. Do you remember what it was like before you went to seminary? Do you remember what your faith was like? Do you remember how you understood the Bible? Do you remember how you understood church? The more training you get, the less you remember what it was like to not have that training. But the people you're leading, they have not gone to the conferences you have gone. They have not taken the classes you have taken. I hear people pastors who complain that their churches are biblically illiterate. They're not illiterate. They just don't have a master's level of understanding of reading Scripture. They hear Scripture every Sunday if they're in church from you. You read it, and they've been reading it for their whole lives. That doesn't make them illiterate. It makes them third grade understanders of the Bible. They read the Bible at a third grade level. So start where they are, not where you are. And don't get frustrated because they're not where you are, because you spent 3 years in seminary. You've gone to all the workshops and extra educational events to learn more deeply about everything. Don't take that for granted, and don't take them for granted. Move them at their pace. Meet them where they are. If a program isn't working or something you're trying to do isn't working, break it down into smaller steps. Break it down into achievable goals so you don't have to go from here to here. You don't have to change all the worship. You can change little bits a year at a time. We did that at Calvin Church, and over 22 years we changed things radically, but we rarely change things radically in 1 year. Another thing, always do stuff that you love. Make sure, if you're engaged in a church, if you love doing Bible studies, don't get so busy you're not doing Bible studies. Do the stuff you love so that gives you the energy to do the stuff you don't love. If you love to study, take time to study. If you love to teach, take time to teach. Whatever it is you love in ministry, give yourself time to do it so that it can sustain you through the things that you don't love. I found this out when I was an associate pastor. Our senior pastor, man, he worked hard. Jack Hodges, he was such a fantastic pastor. Incredible person for me to learn from. But man, did Jack work hard. And at one point I became concerned, and I said to him, so he would teach Kerygma, which was a Bible teaching program that would usually go something like 12 weeks. And I remember once saying to Jack, you look so burned out. Why don't you just give up Kerygma for a bit so you have more time to do this? And he looked at me and said, oh, Graham. He had this deep voice. He said, oh, Graham, if I gave up doing Kerygma, I couldn't do anything else. That's what I love doing. It's the thing that allows me to go to these meetings and spend so much time on the stuff I'd rather not do. He said, Graham, in your ministry, always do what you love so that it gives you energy to do what you don't love. His voice was deeper than mine, even that. He had a great voice. Another thing, Don't lose your temper. Don't lose your temper. And don't fight back, whatever it is, with anger. But also don't cower and don't avoid conflict. You know, one of the things that I think often happens is pastors get frustrated and they can lash out or they can run away. Stand your ground, but work on being calm, not avoiding conflict, but don't create more conflict. I mean, one of the problems in churches is this tendency of people to lose temper. And every time you lose your temper and become angry, they automatically think, not right up here, but deeper down. Well, that's not the way Jesus would have been. Again, maybe it's unfair they think that way. Maybe they shouldn't think that way, but live in the land of is, not in the land of should. Human beings, when faced with other people's anger, it makes them want to walk away and not trust you. And as a pastor, if you lose your temper and yell, you lose trust. Same thing with a counselor. I mean, you wouldn't go to a therapist who yells at you all the time, because they've learned that we don't change people through anger. We change people through compassion, but also staying with it and working through it. I lost my temper one time at Calvin Church, and I realized halfway through they were all looking at me shocked, and I was losing them. And so I did something that I think is one of my greatest inspirations from God. I actually started doubling down on my temper, and I made it over the top. And then, like John Belushi from Saturday Night Live in the 70s, I went, but no, and I fell over in my chair. And they were stunned. I got back up. I started laughing, and I said, that was my best John Belushi imitation. So let's get back to the issue, and I'm sorry about what I just did. And they all laughed, and then we moved on. I managed to save it, and I learned a lesson. Don't lose your temper. Next thing. Again, this is a land of is, not a land of should thing. All of us come from traditions that tell us what the role of a pastor is or what a priest is. It may be that it's functional. Like in my tradition, we are teachers. You know, they call us teaching elders. You know, in others, it may be, you know, in the Episcopal Church, you may serve a priestly function, whatever it is. Doesn't matter what your theology says. Often theology lives in the land of should. The land of is says, whether you like it or not, they look at you like a mother or a father. You are a mother or a father figure. Again, you can argue with me. You can send emails to me trying to argue with me, but I live in the land of is. And this is the way people look at pastors. You know, there are a lot of pastors who will say, you know, I was going through this struggle and they never came to me and asked me how I was doing. Well, yeah, it's kind of like you growing up. Your parents could be going through a problem, but did you ever really ask your mom or dad what they're going through? And sit down and go, how can I make it better? Or sit down and say, please talk to me and help me. You know, I'll help you to understand and sift through it. For the most part, your parents could be losing their jobs, but they come home and you're still thinking about dinner and playing and homework, because that's the way they are. And so one of the things I've learned is people look to me to be like a father. And so while I didn't look at that as my model, I recognized that whatever I did, people were looking to me and they took their clues from me. Always remember that they look to you like they would a father or mother. So they'll care about you, but won't take your feelings and life into consideration that much. That's a reality of your calling. And you see it the same thing in the book of Acts. You never see the apostles complaining or Paul really complaining they don't care about me, or at least I'm not remembering a time he does that. But they are looking to him for wisdom, for guidance, for compassion, for love. And that's part of what our leadership is about. Here's a big one. If you live stream, regularly study the service and yourself from other people's perspectives. You can also include worship team members in assessing what you do. But it is important to get a sense of whether you and the service is helping people experience God, which is what I started out talking about here today. As I said, we started live streaming in 2010, and I regularly studied myself. I realized by doing that, I'm too frenetic in the way I walk around and talk, that I talk too fast, and I can jump from one idea to another. And it helped me to slow down, to really work on how I explain things. Because I'm ADHD, my mind goes at 60,000 miles an hour, and it taught me to bring it down to at least 1,000 miles an hour. So I would go slower. I would simplify. I would work on how do I explain things in a simpler, easier, sometimes more humorous manner. And I would look at the worship service. Does this hymn work? I would study how people were looking, what their body told me about whether they're engaged in worship or not. This is important stuff. By live streaming, you have a resource, and there is nobody who hates looking at themselves in videos more than I do. I'm the same way with pictures. When they gather everybody for pictures, I always try to sneak off because I hate looking at myself in pictures. Next thing that's important, train for what you want. For example, people are never going to become radically welcoming or more welcoming in the church just because you preached a sermon or several sermons on it. Again, maybe they should, but this is reality. They don't listen to our sermons that well. They don't change their behavior that much because we preached on it. The thing I learned studying the non-denominational world is they train for everything. They have huge welcome teams where they train them on how to welcome other people. They pick people who are really good at welcoming, but they train them. How do you introduce yourself? How do you welcome people into the place? How do you help visitors find where they can sit? How do you pay attention to everybody? How do you talk to them? How do you welcome them? How do you remember their names? So that when they're coming in and when they leave, you can say, George, it was great to have you here. Train people for what you want. Training takes more work and more time because you have to figure out how to train people to do it. But once they're trained, then you get more time and you can live a more balanced life. You can live a life that has less stress. I already said this, but I'm going to say it again. When leading change, take it slow. Make sure when you are making changes in the church, don't just surprise people with it. And, we talked about not being on point earlier. When you put yourself on point, you tend to speed everybody up because of the curse of expertise. Because you know what you want and you drive everybody towards it. That's why it's so important to get everybody else involved. Because all those other people who are involved, they know how to go at everybody else's pace. Make sure you take things slow, and when you make changes, do it in compassionate ways that tell people we are doing this to enhance our worship or whatever it is, to bring more people in. But we do want to hear from you. We are willing to talk to you. Whatever we're doing, it's an experiment we're going to do for a while. But we do care about you in this. Final thing on the pragmatic stuff, at least I think is the final thing. Over-communicate changes. When you are making changes in church, when we did it, if we were making a significant change in our worship service, like some of the things we did, we got rid of the call to worship, which I talked about earlier, and replaced it with a Taizé chant, time of silent prayer, and a prayer of blessing over everyone. We did that in September. We started letting people know that we were going to do that come September in our June newsletter. And then in our July and August newsletter, we let them know that again. And then as we moved into August, I began to talk about it in worship, including even one point where we experimented with it during the announcements and showing people what we were going to do. And as we got closer, I would talk about it, and I would also say, this is an experiment we're running to try to bring to try to address things where people are complaining about, like the sanctuary being too noisy before worship, and also feeling like our start was too abrupt. Over-communicate change. Use multimedia, focus on how to word it so it overcomes resistance, and help people feel safe with change. The reason people resist change is usually because we go too fast and we don't explain it. And when that happens, people not only don't feel safe, but they feel like you don't care about them. When you over-communicate, when you focus on how to word it so that it overcomes resistance by being sensitive to where people are, you help people feel safe with the change, and they're much more willing not only to let you change that time, but to trust you in the future. Okay. Oh, I've got more on the pragmatic stuff. So, a few more. Next one is talk in normal language rather than religious jargon, biblical quotes, metaphors, and mythopoetic language. And if you do use these, do it a little bit goes a long way. Here's just a reality. We are no longer in a biblical culture. We are no longer in a culture that regularly uses biblical metaphors for life. Many of the people in our churches may not have grown up in church, may not embrace biblical language. They may not always remember the metaphors you're using from it. What I've learned is talk in a normal language. Talk the way you would to someone across the table from you at dinner. Don't go into flowery metaphors and language that you may even have learned from pastors growing up, or reading your favorite authors who do these wonderful metaphors. It's okay to use a metaphor, but look at the way Jesus talked. He talked in a normal language. He didn't use big theological concepts. And, when he did, he broke it down so that they could understand it by using stories. Don't say something, I can't think of any, I don't know if I can think of anything offhand that's a great example, but, instead of, for example, talking about how we're gathered here as the great cloud of witness to God's work in the world, just say, we're here to be open to God and to experience what God wants us to experience. Break it down in normal language. I find this is a struggle for most church mission statements and vision statements. They fill it up with so much jargon that you have no idea what it says, and nobody can use it because they can't remember it. Go look at your church's own vision or purpose or mission statement. See how much religious jargon there is in there, and then read it once and try to recite it from memory. Most cases you won't be able to do it because it doesn't use normal language. Here's another one, and this kills mainline pastors. For whatever reason, I've discovered mainline pastors tend to be very abstract in their thinking. They love big ideas and they struggle with details. Non-denominational churches sometimes actually don't think in abstract terms, but they're great in detail. We actually need to do both. I have a friend, Jordan Rimmer, who's a fantastic pastor up in Newcastle. And he's beginning to write and teach about a concept from Disney called Imagineering. And if you want to understand why Disney has been so successful, and by the way, if you look through Samaritan's YouTube page, you can find the workshop he did a year and a half ago on Imagineering. Imagineering is the idea that Disney has, which is to come up with this great idea. And now how do you engineer it down to the details? I don't know how many times I've gone to a conference or something where they've had this great idea for some creative thing to bring in worship, but they never walked it through. I remember once I was giving a talk to a denomination gathering in Hershey, and we did a worship service, and I was supposed to preach for the worship service, and then my workshop was supposed to start at 2 o'clock. The worship service was to start at 12:50, and it was to go from 12:50 to 2 o'clock, and then I was to talk until, I think, about 4 or 5 or something like that. And they had 3 rituals they wanted everybody to do. And they said, oh, these 3, they'll only probably take 15 minutes. They took 45 minutes. I didn't start my talk until 2:45, and I then had to scramble on the run to try to figure out, what do I cut out, what do I include, because they really had cut it off because they hadn't walked it through. They hadn't thought about the details. It was stuff like writing sins on a piece of paper and then pounding them into a cross. Well, that's fine, except didn't take into account you've got 20 people wanting to write their sins and they don't know what to write, so they're grabbing the paper and standing there thinking about it. So instead of taking 5 minutes for 20 people, it took 15 minutes. And then people were bumping into each other. Walk through the details, think through the details of whatever it is you're doing, whether it's a program, whether it's an event, whether it's worship. Focus on the details. Whenever we were discussing something on the session, on our board, and it could be building a new soundboard, I insisted that we go walk and go see it and we talk about the details so everybody would understand what's there. Remember, my Myers-Briggs is I'm perceiving, I am not judging. I am intuitive, not sensing. This is not native to me, but I trained myself to do it because I realized it's important. Another thing, learn not to procrastinate. It is really hard to not procrastinate. I was a procrastinator growing up, and I would procrastinate so much in my studies that often I wouldn't start reading a book where we had a final exam on until the night before. And as a result, you can imagine bad grades. And then somewhere in college, I realized I was hurting myself with my procrastination, and I was bugging other people with my procrastination. And so I began to develop systems of study where not only would I read everything, but I would start my study 3 days before. I would do a detailed study, and then I'd do a less detailed study, and the night before I would do a general study, trying to remember what the details were. It made a huge difference. In churches, with conflict, with programs or whatever, find a way to not procrastinate. Okay, I'm going to say a final thing on pragmatics, and then I'm going to do one more, and we'll be done. Okay. This is huge. This is really huge. Huge. And I cannot overemphasize this enough. Clean up your sloppiness. Clean up your sloppiness. The crap all over your desk, it's not because you have a unique system. It's because you're not trying to be organized. And I'm telling you, when people come to your office and they see stuff all over the place, it makes them anxious, it makes them nervous. I want you to imagine going to a therapist or medical doctor. Actually, let's pick a medical doctor. Could you imagine going into an exam room and there's just crap all over the place, syringes just coming out of the cabinets, rubber gloves everywhere, just sloppy? What would your impression of that pastor be? Or if you go to a counselor and they just have books and crap everywhere, what would your thought be? And, again, I'm comfortable with chaos, but I learned my sloppiness makes other people anxious. And the sloppier we are, the more anxious it makes people. Live in the land of is, not the land of should. Maybe they shouldn't be so bothered, but they are. And this is hard, so go get videos, go get books, go get things that can help you figure out a system. And by the way, learn to throw things away. That sermon you had that's been sitting in the stack of sermons since 2003, you're never going to use it again. Get rid of it. It's on your computer. Get rid of it. Or that book that you think someday you might use, you're probably not going to if you don't have enough room for it. Or that item that you used in a sermon 20 years ago or 15 years ago or 5 years ago, at least find somewhere to put it that is not making a mess. Okay, I want to shift now to guidance keys to leading the church. And this is my summary. Number one, church members always want the pastor to do the stuff they don't want to do, and they want to do the stuff they love to do. Lead them to do both. You do not have to do everything. With Vacation Bible School, it's okay to let them do all the work and for you to just be there. You don't, unless this is your specific job, let them organize it. They may not want to. They may want to do the fun stuff, but it's okay to let them do that. I don't know, again, how to overemphasize this, but too often we do the stuff they don't want to do and let them do the stuff they want to do. You're not creating community with that. What you're doing is you're treating them as kindergartners. Let them do the stuff they don't love to do. Teach them how to do it, train them how to do it, praise them for doing it. Next, members want to be motivated in order to serve, but they don't want to be cajoled into serving. Learn to motivate through call and guidance. Daniel Pink, maybe I talked about this earlier. I don't remember because the workshop I gave on this was 2 weeks ago. So I don't remember if I talked about this, but if I did, I'll talk about it again. Daniel Pink, who's an organizational psychologist and researcher, wrote a fantastic book that you can find a TED Talk and a video on it. And it's called Drive, and it's all about how to motivate people. People are motivated when they're doing something that they feel that they have autonomy to do it. And that's autonomy from us. That they feel like they can gain mastery and do it because learning new skills, learning to do these things is actually fun for people. And finally, they're motivated when they have a sense of meaning and purpose. Helping the church to be motivated by giving them things to do where they can be autonomous, where they can learn new skills and get a sense of meaning and purpose. That self-motivates them. And honestly, there's a certain point where with a lot of these people, they already have mastered the skills and they no longer feel meaning and purpose because they already know how to do it. And so then it's important to help them to find something else that maybe they don't have the skills to do, but they can learn. I remember at Calvin Church, the very best chair of our Christian Ed Committee was a guy who was a banker. And he became an elder, and it was natural for everybody to tell him to put him on the finance committee because that's what he's always done. And I remember when we were hashing out who's going to be where, he said, I've done banking all my life. I've always gone to Sunday school. I'd love to do Christian education. And he said, I know you're all going to look at me and say, I don't know what I'm doing. And you're right. But I think I can learn what to do. And we put him in charge of our Christian Ed Committee. And he was fantastic because he was great at listening to people. He was great at summarizing their thoughts. He was great at helping them to find new things. And interesting, I've been gone from Calvin Church for now 9 years, and he still calls me 2 times a year. He's moved to Maryland, and he calls me 2 times a year, not only to ask how I'm doing, but to thank me for allowing him to do that. Because he said, I learned so much about faith and everything else by doing things I was uncomfortable with. 3 more. Church members may be physically and psychologically mature, but they may not be spiritually mature. Don't mistake physical and mental maturity with spiritual maturity. You are there to help them deepen in their life, to come closer to God, which requires you to be mature, but to meet them where they are spiritually. Sometimes that person who's even been reading the Bible their whole life still look at things in only a 6th or 7th or 8th grade way. So your job is to help them to become mature. I've often said that most people in our churches, their spiritual level is the point at which they checked out of church when they were teens, which is usually confirmation. And this is not an insult to say, many people in our churches only have a 9th grade spiritual education. Meet them where they are and help them become more mature, which means you have to also grow spiritually so you know how to lead them. Okay, that means you always have to grow. So the next one is, the more we grow spiritually, the more we're able to lead others in their own personal transformation. So make sure you are always challenging yourself to grow spiritually. Growing spiritually is not the same as taking courses on the Psalms or taking courses on the epistles or taking more courses on theology. It's growing spiritually mature is actually doing things that cause you to struggle, that cause you to question, that cause you to doubt, and to keep pursuing questions that help you grow deeper and closer to God, because that helps you help others grow closer to God. And now we're at the final thing. Everything we do needs to be focused on sparking what I call a JND. A JND is a just noticeable difference. It's not a radical difference. It's not a life-changing difference. But it's something that's just noticeable. I always had this feeling when I preach. I'm not preaching a sermon to change their lives in radical ways, but I am trying to preach a sermon that helps them when they come out of it. I want them to feel a little bit different, like they now have an insight that's just helping them live their life just a little better. That's giving them an insight into God that's just a little bit more than they had before. And I want the worship service to do that. I want our classes to do that. I want our programs to do it. Make sure you're always focused on how to help people have that just noticeable difference. Okay, that's everything. So go out, try to remember everything that we've talked about. And if you can, try to remember the 50,000 things I didn't talk about, which will be hard to remember because I didn't talk about them. But even more, I want you to recognize we don't have to have a declining church. We don't have to have our churches slowly die. But we do have to do things that help them adapt and grow. It takes courage, it takes faith, it takes spirit, it takes discernment, it takes willingness. You were called into your ministry for a purpose. The purpose was to help people grow and experience God and have their lives be changed and transformed. Do that with your church. And let me close with a prayer of blessing on you. Holy and gracious God, I pray that you would be with everyone who's been part of this workshop, who's been watching these videos. Be a guide, be a blessing, be a light, be a love. Help everybody here to grow in spirit and light so that they can lead people to experience you in their lives and live lives that transform others. And Lord, we ask this in Christ's name. Amen.